We were chatting about where the breakthroughs in medicine, or frankly anything, come from, and it's not usually from the research organizations or the mainstream areas of study. In fact, we talked about Marshall and Warren, the two docs from Australia, who not only weren't they part of a big academic research institute, they weren't affiliated with any, and tell us what they came up with.
Well, these two clinicians basically started to notice a relationship between bacteria in stomach biopsies of patients who had stomach ulcers and even duodenal ulcers. And as they dug in deeper, they started to believe that there was a relationship, a causative relationship, potentially, between bacteria and ulcers. And they started talking about it and telling people what they thought and what they were finding, and they were brushed aside, they were dismissed. Eventually, I assume that it was desperation that drove them. I'm not sure why they would do this, but Barry Marshall, the gastroenterologist, as opposed to Robin Warren, who's the pathologist, volunteered to infect himself. So he underwent endoscopy and biopsy, which showed no H. pylori, which was the scientific name for the specific bacteria. He then drank a broth of live H. pylori bacteria, underwent repeat biopsy some days or weeks later, which showed that he was infected and he had ulcers, and then treated with an antimicrobial cocktail, which is still used today. Essentially, there are 3 antibiotics that are used together, and underwent another biopsy and showed that the ulcers had healed, establishing evidence of a causative relationship between infection and ulcers.
And a Nobel Prize later, but the point is, it doesn't always come from the expected channels where breakthroughs come from. Now, cardiologists, we were introduced just recently. We have a mutual friend named Seth Godin, and Seth and I were chatting at a climate event that Worth put on in New York City in September. And he told me about you. He says, I have a friend who's doing amazing work, and you need to meet him. And we chatted, and I said, I have to introduce you to this unbelievable audience here in a couple of weeks, and so thank you for being here. So you work as a cardiologist, but you had a friend.
A very close friend who was suffering from Parkinson's disease. And he was starting to dwindle, and he wanted me to come with him to his doctor's appointments to serve as his advocate. And I said, happy to do that. And then he said, and I need you to figure out a way to treat the disease. And I said, Ivan, I'm not qualified. As a cardiologist in medical school, I paid attention to all the things with procedures and none of the things without. I basically skirted by the neuroscience section of the curriculum just to get through it. I'm not qualified. He was relentless, and so I decided I would start reading so that at least I could ask some good questions. And in the process of doing that, started finding some gaps and some discrepancies in the standard teaching and in the standard practice of how Parkinson's was understood, how Parkinson's was treated. And that eventually led me through a lot of work to identify a different mechanism for the disease than has been reported previously, and identified a drug that could be repurposed and therefore brought into clinical trials quickly to address this abnormality.
Now, 40 plus years of work in Parkinson's, and everybody is dead sure that the disease is a result of a lack of dopamine in the brain. The problem is we don't really have an effective way of testing how much dopamine there is at the cellular level.
Exactly. And so what happened was, starting in 1960, when the first report was published, what investigators did is they biopsied a chunk of the brain that had the relevant part that affects movement, that controls movement, and they took that piece of tissue and basically mashed it up. It was a little more elegant than this.
Not much more.
But not much more. And so they were looking at the fluid levels from outside the cells combined with inside the cells. And the cells that they were looking at included what's referred to as the dopaminergic neurons, the brain cells that produce dopamine, that enable movement, along with a whole bunch of other kinds of cells that are in the brain. So in this soup, they made measurements and saw that dopamine concentration was much, much lower than in a similar soup from brains of people who had just died without Parkinson's. And so everybody saw these papers, and there were 4 of them that came out in the 60s. It was reproduced. It was in people who were treated and those who hadn't been treated with dopaminergic drugs, and it became the standard. By the 4th paper, they also then gave levodopa, and they had to give very, very high doses to get it to cross into the brain effectively. So it wasn't a simple thing, and they saw an immediate response and felt that the combination of the low level in the soup and the response to the drug initially, as we're all familiar with the Oliver Sacks book Awakenings and the Robin Williams movie of that book, it did restore movement, but eventually the disease won in that example. And in Parkinson's, that's what happens. The disease wins. Nobody gets better with Parkinson's. As depressing as that is to say, that's the reality. So there was this belief that dopamine levels were low. By increasing them or increasing dopamine activity, there was improvement, and that's the right way to do it.
But along the way, you're doing research, and it's amazing that you had the time and the wherewithal and the skills to do that kind of research. And you found some German work, which pretty much was the foundation for everything we think we know about Parkinson's.
Yeah, those first 4 papers were published in German by an Austrian group. I remember actually a couple years ago, I talked with one of the big players in Parkinson's disease, and I was explaining to him what I was doing. It was actually very hard to get him to talk to me because he sent the email back, "What do you want to talk about?" My response was, "I want to talk about the fact that we should treat Parkinson's by reducing dopamine." No response. I sent him another one, still no response. I eventually had to resort to a dirty trick. I was friends with his rabbi. I had formerly been part of that synagogue. I called my rabbi and I said, "Hey, Rabbi,
It always starts with a rabbi.
Can you get him to take me seriously enough to have a phone call?" Sure enough, I had the phone call. And when I told him this, he really was like human nature. You know, you do something for 40 or 50 years in that case, and somebody tells you you're backwards, and no matter how diplomatic I was trying to be, human nature, it's hard, especially you're an expert, you figured this out, you've been doing something, you've got convictions.
You're revered in your community, yeah.
It's hard to switch. But the other thing that was remarkable about it was he said to me, "Well, how do you know about that this is what these guys did to create this soup you're talking about?" And I said, "Well, I translated the papers." He said, "Really? Could you send them to me? I'd love to read them." And it was part of the process, realizing that there's all of these situations where we're taught something. There's a standard teaching. There's this source that's revered or a person that's listened to, and yet nobody's looked at the source information. So it wasn't clear that he realized it was a soup that was made. And this became important because as I continued to read, and I basically attacked the disease sequentially, so I started reading from 60 and to the future, I got to the point where I learned that the number of neurons is reduced as well. I also got to the point where I realized that the number of these so-called vesicles, which are essentially little balls inside the cell that store the dopamine and help release it to send the nervous system signal forward and allow movement, those were reduced. So I thought, well, if I've got the total amount of dopamine and I know the number of cells and I know the number of vesicles, I can start out with simple algebra and then later go to a meta-analysis and get all formal, but basically figure out what the average amount of dopamine is inside the cell, that's free inside the cell. Nobody had ever measured that. Nobody had ever calculated that. I can't find anybody who's even said, we need to know this. But in essence, we need to know this because if you don't have enough, you can't send a nervous system signal, so you can't move. And if you have too much, it's toxic. So it causes dysfunction of the cells and then kills the cells.
This is the wow moment for me when we were on the phone, when he said, on the contrary, not only isn't it the causation, but it's toxic if it's in too large a dose, and it could actually be causing the problem. This was like, wow. And when you got to that point, it was a wow for you.
It was a wow for me. I thought, wow, this is kind of crazy. How could everything be so backwards? And you go back and you can look at medical history, and there's Semmelweis with hand washing where he couldn't see, but he had data to prove that there was some infectious agent on the hands of the students going to the OR from the autopsy lab. There's the Barry Marshall, Robin Warren story. I was fortunate enough when I was in training as a fellow in cardiology to be able to start the first phase 2 trial of a beta blocker in heart failure. Now, when I mention that to people, they'll know what a beta blocker is. And if they're sophisticated medically, they'll know that beta blockers are standard treatment for heart failure. When we started that study, beta blockers were all contraindicated. Basically, we were trying to do beta stimulation. And so I witnessed that flip because I was in the middle of that flip. And the biology is actually surprisingly similar between the two things, is the way it looked to me at this point. Because dopamine toxic in Parkinson's, a related compound called norepinephrine, which is like adrenaline, toxic in heart failure. So I thought, well, I just need to do the same thing simplistically in Parkinson's. I'll just get a dopamine blocker. So I started reading about dopamine receptors in the brain. Wow, are they more complicated in their distribution and function than beta receptors are in the heart? It's like, well, that's not going to work. And I was looking for an existing drug because repurposing a drug
because repurposing is easier.
Is so much more time and money efficient. Think about it for a second. You've got a drug, especially if it's a repurposed approved drug. You've got a drug where you already know that it's not going to cause liver failure, that it's not going to cause cardiac arrhythmic death. All these crazy things that happen in drug development, that are why these programs had to be so big to look for these rare catastrophic things and take so long. I already know they don't exist with this drug.
And what is the drug?
Its generic name is metyrosine. Its trade name is Demsur. It was developed by Merck and approved in 1979 for a complication of a very rare cancer called pheochromocytoma. Usually when I'm talking to other doctors, I say something with confidence. Nobody in this room has ever seen a case of pheochromocytoma, but we've all learned about it. I happen to know there's one person in this room who actually treated one case. So I can't say that, but it's that rare. And this drug has been used generally short term, but for decades without surprising safety.
How did you find that drug? What was the properties and how it behaved that became attractive to you?
Well, again, I'm kind of old-fashioned. I started when beta blockers were contraindicated in heart failure. So, you look at standard pharmacologic strategies to treat a disease. So, everybody's talking about biologics and gene therapies and all that sort of stuff. I'm old-fashioned. I'm a pharmacology kind of person, not trained as a pharmacologist, but that's how I approach these things.
Goes back to being at the Holiday Inn Express last night.
Exactly. And I couldn't use a dopamine blocker because it was too complicated for me to understand how to do it. So I thought, well, I'll take the other approach that's been used forever, which is finding the rate-limiting enzyme for the synthesis of a molecule and blocking that enzyme. So the rate-limiting enzyme for the synthesis of dopamine is something called tyrosine hydroxylase. I thought, okay, I can't do a dopamine blocker. I'll do a tyrosine hydroxylase inhibitor. So it's old-fashioned pharmacology. So then I had to look for a tyrosine hydroxylase inhibitor.
So you find this platform, this approved drug, and what do you have to do to it now? You're not talking about a better treatment. You're talking about curing.
I don't say curing, because the way I think about diseases like Parkinson's is I think it's almost like a two-stage kind of thing. There's something that starts the process that probably goes on for at least 10 or even 20 years in most cases before it becomes evident. And there's something that drives the disease to keep getting worse. So I don't know what starts it. I think that's going to be really hard to figure out without some sort of patient-specific time machine. But we've got a lot of tech people here today, so that might be possible. What I'm looking at is what do I think could drive the disease? And if you identify data that show that dopamine is actually elevated inside the dopaminergic neurons, which, by the way, has now been published in a peer-reviewed journal, got that published, then you start to look at whether that could be the factor that drives the disease. And if you look at the current models and the fact that they suggest it's a lack of dopamine, and yet you give dopamine and things temporarily get a little bit better, temporarily for a few months. Now, doctors will tell you for years, but considering that there's no placebo-controlled trial longer than 9 months, it's hard to convince me that they know the drug works for years. So we know out to about 9 months, and for 3 to 6 months, definitely better than baseline. For 9 months, definitely better than placebo. Okay, so that we know. But that's not fixing the disease. That's not defeating the disease. That's not reversing the disease manifestation.
But your work,
I
your
think,
drug, which is method patented,
right.
could be the thing that's, where are you now? What?
So again, sorry to be not cure, but stop the progression, reverse the progression. These are the kinds of things we see in a lot of beta blockers and heart failure. Reverse the progression, reverse the functional disability. I mean, give people their lives back. That I think is a very strong possibility. And
where are you in this process?
So in addition to identifying the mechanism that nobody's gone after, identifying a drug that most Parkinson's experts' first response to me when I suggested is, you're going to hurt somebody. And then I show them the data that says, no, I will not hurt somebody, and I'll probably improve them. Yeah. I now have 3 sets of data from 3 preclinical models using the drug, showing that
in animal testing.
In animal testing or cell testing, showing that it reverses cell dysfunction, cell pathology, and restores movement almost to baseline. Wow. And so now I'm in the fundraising stage to start a phase 2 clinical trial. I've already engaged with the FDA through a pre-IND process.
And a good doc used to work at the FDA, so the good news is he knows the channels and has friends.
Unfortunately, my friends are in the device center, and I'm working with the drug center, so I don't have that advantage.
But you know where the cafeteria is.
I know where the cafeteria is. That's true. I can't get in there because I'm not an employee anymore. I've got basically everything set up where as soon as I get funding, an IND is submitted, and the trial started in 6 months. And within about 6 months of there, we'll start seeing the first clinical data.
How exciting. $5 million. How do you raise that? Come to a conference with a bunch of smart rich people?
I'm looking. The problem is that it's hard to get people who are expert in this disease to sit down with me and look at the data. So what's been happening, and that's starting to change, but for the first couple years, I would talk to people. They would say they're going to hurt people, and I said, "Well, do you want me to talk about this respond to you from a pharmacology point of view? Because I've got a tremendous amount of pharmacology data, including stuff that I got from the FDA by Freedom of Information from the 1979 review. So I've got, and lots of stuff's been published. So I can just show you from the pharmacology data why that's. Although I worry about everything. So I worry about hurting people, don't get me wrong, but I think that's a relatively remote possibility. Besides, even if somebody worsens, because I'm affecting the rate-limiting enzyme right before L-DOPA is formed, it's easy to treat a problem by giving L-DOPA, which wouldn't be affected by this drug. So it's easy to rescue somebody. And I have a specific way to do that in the protocol that I submitted to the FDA, which they were fine with. I'm looking for investors who allow me to talk to their experts early in the process. And when I've done that, I've got a couple of groups that are now asking for more information. If they just call up their doctor, it'll be like the one my rabbi got me to, where he's like, reduced dopamine, that's a dumb idea. You shouldn't invest in that. And if they look at the data, it's different. I've got a first-class, world-class scientific advisory board. I've got several clinical trial sites ready to go with people who looked at the data with me to establish the mechanism, to understand the pharmacology, to see the effects of the drug in these preclinical models, who are on board saying, look, you're enthusiastic. We've got equipoise. Which is what I'm looking for in an investigator. We believe the data support doing a study. And one more thing, because I'm coming to a tech group, last night I spent some time with ChatGPT because I thought I have nothing, there's no AI. There's no machine learning.
Yeah.
I've got no devices. I've got nothing. What am I doing at this conference? So I need to be ready. I can share with anybody who wants to see the Chat GPT discussion, which suggests that I should move into clinical trials after filing an IND.
I'm convinced. I hope, Dan, that we're doing a cover story at Worth on this day, on this moment, on this man, in a short period of time about how we're doing in clinical trials and how they're looking really promising, because there's a lot of people who will really benefit from your work. Thank you.